Assalamu alaikum, and just give me a minute to start, and hopefully give a few minutes for people to join, and we're going to start our conversation for today. And what I was hoping to cover in the current discussion is Palestine's independence. And the reason for really focusing on this, and for those who have taken a look at the post that I put on Facebook that looked at the history of the Palestinian government that was declared on September 23rd, 1948. And it has been a constant struggle and challenge for the Palestinians to actually extricate themselves out of settler colonialism. And one way to think of the problem that we are confronting and continue to confront is that we have accepted colonial legalism. That's a term I use, colonial legalism, and have shaped our discourse in relations to it. Colonial legalism creates legal facts, and I put them between two quotation marks. And these legal facts begin to shape not only the relationship of the settler colonial enterprise with the land, the country, the borders, the society, but the more critical part is the colonized population and its own political infrastructure begin to shape its relation and respond to and interact with colonial legalism. And as such, the challenge of extricating oneself from that is how to come out of a legal box, a settler colonial legal box that has been set in motion to actually dispossess the indigenous population, the Palestinians, and make their dispossessor having the legal rights or legal title that is recognized or a given recognition by the same states and powers that adopted the settler colonial project from its inception. So in this sense, Palestine was not lost or occupied in 1948. Palestine was occupied by the British on December 10th, 1917. And it is from that moment on the colonial legalism begins to take shape, creating legal facts on paper that corresponds to the dispossession and creating other facts on the ground all the way up to the present period of the Israeli government moving to annex another part of historical Palestine. Now, the first document of this settler colonial legalism and colonial legalism is the Balfour Declaration itself, that created the scope of creating a homeland for the Jewish people, while the Palestinians were not mentioned other than their identity or character being non-Jewish, and only their civil and religious rights, but no political rights to be given. So that's a colonial legalism that already crafted on the Palestinian landscape who is to be granted political rights and who is actually to be subject or in essence dispossessed of political rights. The further ramification of the Balfour Declaration is incorporation into the League of Nations that created the mandate. And the mandate is in essence the incubation of a settler colonial project and preparation for the Zionist state in Palestine to emerge through the facilitation of the immigration to Palestine for the purpose of creating settlements and creating settler communities, in essence, creating a state within the mandate state, while simultaneously denying the Palestinians who constituted 97% of the population in Palestine any legal rights, any political rights, even in the creation of the administrative infrastructure. It actually, while it gave recognition to the Palestinian by creating a forum for the Palestinians to participate, but this was on the creating an equal footing for the settler colonials, in essence, to have a veto power over the Palestinian rights. So that's been the nature of settler colonialism, in essence, is creating the legal framework in order to dispossess the population. So I'm not going to really deal with each period, but what I wanted to move is to the 1948 period in particular. The United Nations passed Resolution 181 in 1947, which is also a colonial legalism. The fact that it was the United Nations does not preclude it or actually stop it from still being a framework of colonial legalism, because the Palestinians, who were the indigenous populations, were not party to a decision from a United Nations that in essence worked to issue a resolution to dispossess the Palestinians and give 56% of their land to a foreign entity that has been implanted in Palestine through the cooperation and the participation of the British. Now, the fact that the British and the Zionists had a difference of opinion and on the timeline and so on should not actually get us to step back from understanding that Resolution 181 of 1947 in the United Nations General Assembly was colonial legalism. And one also can add that the United States threatened and used its foreign aid at the time to make sure that the vote of the partition actually is achieved in the United Nations General Assembly. It was not a National Security Council resolution, but that's a separate issue. So Resolution 181 itself is a colonial legalism. As the British exited Palestine and ended their mandate power and authority over Palestine on May 14th, 1948, the Zionist movement went and declared a government with authority that immediately got the recognition both of the United States as well as the Soviet Union at the time, and later in short period, other European states gave recognition to the state of Israel. So we'll set that aside. The question of what happened to the Palestinians. There were still, even though that in the 1948 area were subject to the expulsion, created the refugee camp, the Laji'in, that were sent out of the 1948 area. But actually, Palestinians began to think about their political rights before 47. You could say that the 1936-39 period of the general Arab strike, or another intifada in 36-39, was to assert political rights for over land, over decision making, over immigration, and the fact that the British mobilized massively to put down the Palestinian rebellion and exile Palestinian leadership, and also facilitating in partnership that both the Palestinians were facing the Zionist militias that were operating against the Palestinians, as well as facing the British power. And one can add also the Palestinians faced Arab countries' manipulation and machination that were working hand in hand to cut their own deals with the British at the time. So Palestinians have always faced overwhelming odds. So as the state of Israel is declared, the Palestinians actually called for Hukumat Umum Palestine, a government of the Republic of Palestine, Umum Palestine meaning all of Palestine, to cover the totality of Palestine. And this attempt to formulate the Republic of Palestine, the All Palestine government, met immediately to try to actually declare independence, rightly so, even though Palestinians lost a big chunk of Palestine. Losing a chunk does not negate the claims of sovereignty. So in here one has to distinguish between one losing a portion of their rightful land and having control over it and sovereignty over it. So I will still assert that the Palestinians have sovereignty over historical Palestine, even though that this territory, historical Palestine, is currently under settler colonial occupation, does not negate nor remove the right to such sovereignty and such land. So that's a very important in here, that the fact that is under occupation and controlled by a settler colonial enterprise, Zionism, that is in alliance with the time with Britain and then later on with the United States and European powers, that's just an aspect of the consequences and realities that as a result of unfolding events. But that in itself does not negate nor removes the right of sovereignty of Palestinians for their land. So on September 23rd of 1948, there was actually a declaration for the Republic of Palestine, Hukumat Umum Palestine. There was a meeting in Gaza, was led by Ahmed Hilmi Abdel Baqi, and the gathering actually informed the Arab League and the General Secretary of the Arab League for what the meeting is about, and that there will be a declaration for a government, a new government for the Palestinian people. And the request was actually sent to the Arab League of Nations to actually give this, the Arab League, sorry, to give recognition and facilitation. This was followed by another meeting on October 1st as well for the government with the Palestinian National Council at the time, Al-Majlis Al-Watani Al-Falastini, to begin to prepare for really how to develop the needed structures and the needed tools to actually get this government into being a functional government and begin to take steps to actualize the Palestinian Declaration of Independence and establishing a full state. However, this declaration was met by resistance. One, it was resisted by the Jordanian monarch at the time, King Abdullah, and actually carried out a public campaign to actually negate and challenge the authority and the veracity of the Republic of Palestine that was declared in this meeting. But simultaneously, the Jordanian government and the Jordanian monarchy called for a Palestinian conference to be held in Amman under the leadership of Salman al-Naji al-Farouqi, as well as other dignitaries, and then followed by another meeting in Jericho, likewise on December 1st, led by Sheikh Muhammad Ali al-Ja'bari, the head or the mayor of the Khalil municipality. It is in these meetings that were held in Amman and Jericho that the Palestinian elite or handpicked leaders declared the unification of Palestine or the annexation of the Palestinian territory, especially in the West Bank, to be part of Jordan, and to give the nod and the recognition of King Abdullah to be the sovereign over Palestine and Jordan. And as such, this negated the establishment or the coming forth of an independent Palestinian government and independent state, and in particular having sovereignty over those territories that were at least resisted away from the Zionists, as well as were part of the illegal partition plan of the United Nations. This is not only to leave and to imply that only Jordan, but also other Arab governments and monarchies, including Egypt, the Gulf states at the time, all resisted. And in essence, from that moment on, from December of 1948, the notion of the Palestinian dignitaries that met said that the Palestinian cause will be taken care of or will be under the oversight of the Arab kings and leaders, and the Palestinian population should be comforted that their cause is now in the hands of their Arab brothers and monarchies. And I think in here we have a precise aspect in here, that if we look at the topography of the Arab world leadership at the time, it's either were subject to British colonial control, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, as well as the new monarchies and municipalities that developed in the Gulf, or subject to the French in relations to Lebanon, and Syria was still in an early formation of its independence, and also most of North Africa. So in essence, in here, the British were engaging simultaneously in building up colonial legalism with the Zionist and settler colonialism, while also working with Arab governments of the time that were subject to their control and power to actually resist the Palestinian ability to achieve independence and sovereignty over the remaining part. Now, the government actually continued to function in Gaza. It actually issued passports. It's actually a green passport if you looked at it, it's the passport of the state of Palestine that you actually see in the post. And as such, this passport, this recognition, was in the hope that other Arab governments would begin to give aid and support for this independence that the Palestinians were attempting to achieve at that particular time. In a short period, right at the end of 1948 into 1949, the Egyptian government actually interfered and demanded that the Palestinian leadership almost cease and desist any type of operations, any type of engagement in Gaza, and should be moved immediately to Cairo in order to be under the direct control and domination of the Egyptian government, which at the time was still subject to heavy British control under King Farouk. So that's how we move from the possibility of having independence and having sovereignty over the remaining parts and become, in essence, a stateless people with a completely disempowered political infrastructure. And from that moment on, Palestinian cause were subject to really Arab state control and apparatus. Even the creation of the Palestine Liberation Organization in the late 50s into the early 60s was actually to try to contain the rising resistance and anger that was being present in the refugee camps and among the Palestinians. So one way to actually to create almost a controlling mechanism was to formulate the PLO, and initially the appointment of the leadership was in the hands of Egypt of Jamal Abdel Nasser, appointing the leadership of the PLO. And it wasn't until after 67 that the PLO actually shifts out or begins to take a independent trajectory. But nevertheless, even from that moment, I would argue that the PLO itself became a byproduct of the Arab structure that was put in place beginning from the 1940s, but more so even after some of the Arab governments that gained their independence from the colonial era. And one way that the PLO became a byproduct of the Arab is that the PLO was actually, and in here it's very difficult to articulate, but the PLO was bought into the Arab structure by means of massive amount of resources that were laid the PLO in essence to bring about a higher level of corruption internally, and each of the Arab countries at a certain point adopted or purchased, in essence, its own stake within the Palestine Liberation Organization in order to actually settle its own political conflicts with its neighbor, but also to have almost a veto power or a constant veto power over Palestinian political decision making to a disastrous consequences, because again, as Palestinian factions became subject to this dynamic, they ended up actually subverting Palestinians' visions and aspiration for independence and sovereignty to be subject to the political decision-making manipulation priorities of Arab governments. And we saw some of the disastrous consequences, whether it's in Jordan, in Lebanon, later on in Iraq, and I would say we're still maneuvering within that particular landscape. Now, what I wanted to actually assert is that the Palestinians need to declare their independence and still assert and put forth a government in exile, and meaning that we claim, in essence, our right to sovereignty over historical Palestine, a sovereignty that is in suspension of actual ability to exercise that sovereignty due to the presence of a settler colonial project and program. So that for me is the step one in response, not only to the annexation of the present, but the total failure of the Oslo framework, which again, for me, the Oslo framework was to bring Palestinians back into classical colonialism rather than the particular type that Israel wanted to practice. But more so, it's actually to assert that Palestine and the Palestinians have sovereignty over their land all the way back to the Balfour Declaration and from the moment of the arrival of the British. The fact that the British created colonial legalism should not allow us or make us accept what the consequences of colonial legalism. I would compare it to the following, the book of Don't Think of an Elephant. And when I say don't think of an elephant, you immediately begin to think of an elephant. In the same way, when we think of Palestine, when we immediately begin to think of the structure that the British have put in place, we are actually structuring all of our relationship to Palestine, to settler colonialism, Zionist settler colonialism, and European powers and the US, as well as the United Nations, with the colonial legalism. So what we need, again, is that first step is to assert unequivocally that Palestinians have total sovereignty over historical Palestine. And this sovereignty right now is under duress due to the presence of a settler colonial project. So that's one. The second is that we do have to actually call for the disbandment of the Palestinian Authority because the Palestinian Authority is a byproduct of the settler colonialism and in essence putting the responsibility on securing the settlements, the settlers, and Israel's security on the Palestinian population, which is also not unique in classical colonial structures. Again, if you studied colonization in India, colonization in North Africa, you always have a Campadora class, a group within the colonized population, and that group within the colonized population gets to actually be empowered or given the responsibility to run the native plantation, to be the chiefs, to control the indigenous population. And behind them are the colonial powers itself, whether the British, the French, and in our case, it is the, right now, the Israeli settler colonial project that is not only financing the training as well as coordinating every step of the way with the Palestinian Authority. Now, Yasser Arafat thought that he's going to negotiate his way out of this box, but I think he was mistaken due to a variety of issues that he confronted after the first Gulf War and the collapse of the Arab world at that point. But setting that aside, the Palestinian Authority today, with all intensive purposes, is a structure that is set in place to control the Palestinian population and secure the settlements and settlers without the possibility of sovereignty or independence as a result of this process. So the government in exile should be empowered and should articulate, in my view, its political program, both short-term and long-term, and begin to actually put a strategy of how to confront settler colonialism in a prolonged outlay of both resources as well as infrastructure to deal with. And I think in Government in Exile, the PLO as an institution and the Palestine National Council as an institution should be reconfigured and re-energized and on a democratic principles and our democratic foundation on on an equal footing for all the different parts of the Palestinian society, those in the West Bank, those in Gaza Strip, those that are in the diaspora around the Arab countries, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia, or other parts of the world, including here the United States, Europe, Chile, El Salvador, and so on, and create a program that actually would put this reinvigorated structure into mobilization in such a way that we will be able to actually make the legitimate claim of sovereignty and begin to actualize it in such a political program. In this, I would say we have a positive aspect or positive resources globally. We have a large number of Palestinians across the world. We also have a large number of states that have given recognition to the Palestinians. We also have a very vibrant solidarity movement that have adopted the PDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanction. So we are starting with a critical mass. But what we want is that the political leadership right now in the Palestinian Authority is a cause of this empowerment, and actually often functions as a disruptive factor, and in essence gives the impression that there is something in there of legitimacy to a settler colonial project. And the sooner that we begin to move in this direction in a serious way, again, this is not to disrespect, I'd love for our Palestinian leadership to be recognized, to be, in essence, celebrated for its accomplishment, to be welcomed and be seen as a dignified, principled, moral, ethical, that it actually is not at the service, backing service of Netanyahu on any of his ilk, but that is not where we are right now. And I think what we need is to reshape this part of our body politic in order to do so. And I would also encourage that both the Palestinian leadership in Gaza and the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, likewise, to set aside their stock differences and their instrumentalized division that only weakens both Palestinians inside as well as Palestinians abroad. And I think that is, for me, is the critical piece. So to sum it up, Palestine was declared independent in 1948. And what we need is to re-articulate that independence and assert total sovereignty of historical Palestine. This sovereignty is not negated. The fact that you built settlement, the fact that you annexed, the fact that you dug and took water wells, the fact that all these facts are just only momentary impediments to the actualization of sovereignty. So the first act is in the mind. Stephen Biko says the most dangerous weapons in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Our mind has been to actually think of Palestine in relations to a neighborhood or a village or a permit or a VIP, or to try to struggle for an annexation of one part or the other. Important as it may be, these are only tactical elements that Israel puts in to create legal colonial facts on the ground that is followed by facts on the ground building and otherwise. And what we need is to actually refuse to play that game, which often not only Israel is playing, but also send us all these delegations from the United States, from Europe, also some of our Arab governments and their leaders who come in really to articulate an American-Israeli package because they receive foreign aid from the United States, or they have a most favored nation clause in terms of trade relations with the US. So there's a whole host of packages that are placed in there. So we also need to assert that Arab governments and Arab leaders, as well others who view the Palestine as part of their file, to achieve their own narrowly constructed self-benefit, that also that has to be recognized and to be dealt with accordingly. So these are, for me, are the building blocks of reshaping the conversation and reshaping the discussion in there. And what we need is, as we assert sovereignty and have a government, we need to also develop a full-fledged constitution that would actually be a decolonial constitution. And what is a decolonial constitution? Meaning that we don't use the colonial legalism or the structures that have been placed upon us to frame the work of rights, responsibilities, and associate and membership into the polity. I tend to believe that difference should not be the basis of membership, but rather its commitment to the society and uplifting the society, and actually adherence to recognition of the Palestinian sovereignty and recognition of a political program that encompasses everyone with diversities of viewpoints and diversity of understandings coming to build the society together. So again, how to do that requires for us a considerable time for us to actually come into that point. I tend to believe that we are in a very positive period in history, despite the difficulties and the challenges that the world, both globally as well as regionally, is moving through a major crisis. But a crisis also is a period of opportunity. And I think what we need is to bring the agenda forward and bring our ideas forward at a time where I think there is openness right now to consider other issues that are beyond, that have, you know, in a short period of time, we're beyond consideration. And I think what we need is to understand that period to continue to build and assert our calls to bring about freedom, dignity, and justice for the Palestinians. So this is what I wanted to cover today. Hopefully, if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to actually respond to it. So if you have any questions, comments, feel free to write, and I will actually try to respond to as many of those as possible. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll give it few minutes. If not, we'll call it an early day. Just for me, it was a short talk today. I just came back from a demonstration in San Francisco in front of the Israeli consulate. So if you don't have any questions at this point, so Jazakumullah khair for being with me. And you have to think the impossible in order to make it possible. But if you begin by saying nothing is possible, then there is no need for you to actually challenge and alter and transform the reality that is in front of us. I do believe that our role is to challenge the reality and to shape it for the better. And I'm committed to a decolonial vision and decolonial view of the world. So, Assalamu alaikum, and Jazakumullah khair for being with me today, and look forward to another conversation maybe in the future as well.